Well, we're going to keep this on German Lutheran time, so we probably better crank it up here at 7. Good evening and welcome to Concordia Lutheran Church here in Kirkwood, Missouri. I'm John Eckridge, and I'm the chairman of this new speaker series entitled Engaging Faith and Culture. The past 5 years, and especially the last 10 months, have been chaotic, distressful, and a dividing time, particularly in our United States. There is a palpable anxiety in our land, and I suspect you're uncomfortable as we are about this unrest, or you probably wouldn't be here joining us this evening. I also suspect that you share with us a concern for the health and the well-being of both our faith community and our American culture as we live into this second quarter of this century. We find ourselves continuously turning to the same sources of information and opinion, and so we begin to live within silos, really hearing those who always seem to share the same perspectives that we do. If we continue on that pathway, I fear that we may end up somewhat like those 3 very religious gentlemen who were traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho and come upon an injured neighbor. Might we end up just passing them by? What if that person is on Adams or Lockwood between Webster and Kirkwood? Do we pass them by, or do we stop and try to help mend wounds? Here's an idea, and it's the idea of this program. Let's gather together some knowledgeable, wise, well-balanced speakers who are well-versed in God's Word and who live and work actually in the dividing topics of our hot-button issues, and become, first of all, better educated as to the roots of this turmoil, so that we can think and talk and respond with compassion rather than impatience or outrage or even worse, indifference. With that understanding, then let us absorb or ingest that chaos around us rather than adding to it. I think God really equips us by grace and through faith to become human shock absorbers for a chaotic culture. Then let us embrace the cross and follow the Good Shepherd, knowing that he is going to be leading us to stiller waters, to calm and to peace. And then finally, it is our faith that we will experience God's goodness and mercy flowing from this hope in Jesus. And our calling is to be deliverers of that very same hope to each neighbor along our journey. That's the purpose of this speaker series. The mission statement of Concordia is sharing love alive. The love alive in Jesus Christ, and to put that towards healing and service within our families and our communities. Now, we can't do this alone. We are most thankful to the Lutheran Foundation of St. Louis for generous underwriting of this and their president, Matt Miller. The foundation is the continuation of many generations of faithful Lutherans who have been working healing within this community, starting at the old Lutheran Hospital in South St. Louis, certainly through senior care facilities all through our community, through social service and adoption and placement programs, all of these people committed to healing and to caring ministries. And I most certainly wish to extend great appreciation to our staff here at Concordia and for making this such a welcoming event. And you'll notice also the members of our committee, which have all contributed in tremendous ways to this program. They'll have the badges on, so you'll know who they are. Well, music provides a wonderful conduit for us to appreciate and to introduce the subjects of our concern. And so those of us who frequent worship here at Concordia can't imagine any event without a song. And so I'm most thankful to our music ministry staff, Brendan, Katie, and their wonderful team, for leading us in this opening song, Holy Spirit, Living Breath of God. We're going to sing this song at the beginning of each of these sessions for the next 2 years as we cover all of this wonderful material. This song comes to us from Keith and Kristen Giddy, who have led worship here in past years at Concordia. So as you get to know this song, know the melody, please join along in the singing.
Spirit, living breath of God, breathe new life into my willing soul. Bring the presence of the risen Lord to renew my heart and make me whole. Cause your word to come alive in me. Give me faith for what I cannot see. Give me passion for your purity. Holy Spirit, breathe new life in me. Holy Spirit, come abide within. May your joy be seen in all I do. Love enough to cover every sin in each thought and deed and attitude. Kindness to the greatest and the least. Gentleness that sows the path of peace. Turn my strivings into works of grace. Breath of God, show Christ in all I do. Holy Spirit, from creation's birth, giving life to all that God has made. Show your power once again on earth. Cause your church to hunger for your ways. Let the fragrance of our prayers arise. Lead us on the road of sacrifice, that in unity the face of Christ will be clear for all the world is able to do far more abundantly than all that we could ask or think, according to the power at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
That was awesome. Thank you. It's now my honor to introduce our kickoff speaker for this series, the Reverend Dr. Chad Lakeys, Vice President for Ministry Engagement for Lutheran Hour Ministries. And to do that, it's my privilege to introduce one of our committee members, B. Hopi, who has worked with Chad extensively in the past at Lutheran Hour.
Thank you for being here. It is my honor to introduce to you our first speaker for this series speaker, Chad Lakeys, Vice President of Ministry Engagement for Lutheran Hour Ministries, my boss for 5 years. I retired last year, I wonder why. But above all, a great Christian, a sincere and honest Christian, and the best friend that one could hope for. You have his bio printed inside of this pamphlet that you received when you checked in, so I'm not going to go over that. But his topic is talking to today's turbulence. And when we think that we are living in a turbulent world, we have to remember that we are not the first or the last ones to live in such a world. Turbulence has happened since the beginning of time. If you look at the people of the Old Testament and even the New Testament, even in Jesus' time, turbulence was something that they had to struggle with on a daily basis. Today is no different. The problems may be different. We may have different narratives and things that happen to us, but we are on the same boat. In the midst of that turbulence, in the midst of that darkness that sometimes surrounds us, there is always hope. There is always light, a light that wants to break through into that darkness. And that's why we have Reverend Dr. Chad Lakeys with us tonight to speak to that, to see how we can break through that darkness with the light of Christ. So, Chad, the podium is yours, and we can welcome him with a round of applause.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, so the devil always tries to stop us when it comes to technology. It's his easiest way to frustrate us. None of us want to be the people running technology, so thank you to all of them who are patiently working to make this work. And all of the pre-work that they did to set it up, thanks to the musicians. Thank you to John for the invitation. Thank you to Beatrice for the warm introduction. And no, she didn't retire because of me. Don't listen to that. John gave you a unique title in terms of the promo for this. So the PR says, tolerance and turbulence. What I really want to dive into is this topic of how to reach out in a secular age. I'll be back again in January, and I think my topic then will be a little more appropriate to the title that John chose for tonight, where I'll talk about how not to let issues prevent relationships. But I think still part of what Beatrice used to introduce tonight is still appropriate for what I'm going to say. I want to set up for a little while, what time is it? What's happening culturally? And maybe give a name to a lot of the things that perhaps you sense and feel but don't quite know how to describe or articulate. I like David Brooks, the New York Times columnist. Maybe some of you are familiar with him. He's written a handful of books. He's one of my favorite authors. One of the things that he says is, I am just a beggar telling other beggars where I found bread. And I'm just going to steal that same sort of thing. I'm not doing anything more than just sharing good, helpful resources with you in a way that I was kind of synthesized and I thought was helpful to solve a problem for me. And lo and behold, it's actually been helpful for others. So I continue to give this talk across the country to all kinds of different groups. So I'm really privileged to be here and do it tonight. If you want these slides, I am happy to give them to you. My contact information will be at the end, so no need to pull out your phones and take pictures of things. I'm happy to send it to you as a PDF. You can just email me tomorrow or whenever you remember that you want it. But I'm going to start like this, and here's my way that I'm kind of jamming this into John's framework of a title for me, and then where I'm going to go from here. So I'll call this Our Turbulent Moment. In the 1960s, some of you lived through a really turbulent time in our culture, maybe reminiscent of what's happening today. I'm not old enough to have remembered any of that. I was born in 1980. I don't mean to make any of you feel young. But reading some of the things that I've come across, I stumbled on something that was reflecting on those days, a sociologist talking about what was going on in culture. But as I read it, right, somebody born in more my time and experienced the experiences I've had, I thought, gosh, this seems really prophetic, really prescient, really descriptive of now. And so this is the sociologist Robert Nisbet talking. Wrote this in 1975, reflecting on the turbulent period that happened just before that. All of the things that were happening with civil rights, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Vietnam, et cetera, the school riots in '68. Periodically, he says, in Western history, twilight ages make their appearance. Processes of decline and erosion of institutions are more evident than those of genesis and development. Something like a vacuum obtains in the moral order for large numbers of people. Human loyalties, uprooted from accustomed soil, can be seen tumbling across the landscape with no scheme of larger purpose to fix them. He goes on to say, individualism reveals itself less as achievement and enterprise than as egoism and mere performance. Retreat from the major to the minor, from the noble to the trivial, the communal to the personal, and from the objective to the subjective is commonplace. There's a widely expressed sense of degradation of values and corruption of culture. The sense of estrangement from community is strong. And for the slightly more than quarter of a century that I've been a follower of Jesus, I have certainly heard so many Christians talk this way. Maybe not with as much eloquence and how concisely he kind of captures our time. But in one paragraph, I think it's perhaps come to life again, the reality of this description, the appropriateness of it for our time, even as much as it might have served well in 1975, when he published it as a book following a really successful article in '71 of the same title. So I hope that resonates and kind of starts out like, this is the background that we're in, but I want to dive a little bit deeper. So I'll give you an outline of what I really want to walk us through for most of our time together. I've titled our presentation, How to Reach Out in a Secular Age, and so I want to do what a good theologian or philosopher would do, and I'll borrow from a philosopher. We need to define our terms, and in particular, define secular. I think we all think we know what we mean when we say secular. And we'll go through a couple of those meanings. But the philosopher that I'll borrow from offers us yet another, something of a paradigm-shifting definition that helps us to understand what time it is a little better than the usual definitions of that term. And then I'll borrow a metaphor. We'll talk about looking for cracks in the secular for the light to break through. And all I really mean by this is something we talk about at Lutheran Hour Ministries a lot, conversational and ministry opportunities. And usually I do two kinds of experience from our lives, but I'll add a third tonight just because I have enough time. And then finally, the whole motivation of all of this is part of what we sang at the end of that song in the third verse. We want to connect people to the transcendent through spiritual conversations and do that by making the best use of the time. And that might sound vague and generic. We use the language at Lutheran Hour Ministries of spiritual conversations, and for us it's a really big bucket term. We think it's important even when you're talking about someone, even talking with someone, and they're talking about their experience, even of something like unbelief or belief of something other than Christianity, because that's still a space in which God might work to allow you to talk about where you're coming from, the faith and the deep convictions that you have. It's also sensitive to the fact of how outsiders talk. They don't talk like we do, if you've not noticed that. For example, they don't call themselves non-Christians. That's a title we have for them. So we're trying to be sensitive in that sort of way, a posture that we learn from Jesus, from St. Paul, and from so many other heroes of our faith. So let's get going with that. And I'll begin kind of this first section. I'll warn you, it's going to be a little heady, a little academic. I'm going to carry you through that, walk you through that, help you understand it, and I hope kind of feel it. And then I'll move from there into something like much more practical. But it'll be practical against that background that I'm trying to set up. So this first part, 20 or so minutes, and then the rest is like, well, so what do we do? Which I think is what a lot of us want to get to most of the time. So the background. I think we are right now the church in occupied territory. And all I mean by that is this. The church, as we know it and have experienced for most of our lives, is no longer dominant in terms of a voice and influence in contemporary Western culture. For more than 3 decades, scholars have been using the phrase post-Christian to describe our culture. Perhaps one of the first to do that was the late missiologist Leslie Newbigin. He was a missionary in India, sent there from Britain, where he grew up and learned his theology, became a pastor, became a missionary, and so on. He lived there for more than a quarter of a century, and then he came back to the West to realize this is a different place. This is a different culture. Something has changed, and he struggled to name it. But he wrote several books that became very impactful to many of us who have been trained for ministry. And he was one of the first to use this phrase, we live in a post-Christian culture. Another idea is that we are resident aliens. This is our social status as Christians, or the church's social status in our culture, coming partly from, say, 1 Peter, but the phrase has really been popularized by other theologians like Stanley Hauerwas and William Willimon, if you've heard of them, in a book by that actual name. And as we've had to live through the shift, as many of us have, if any of you are older than me, and that doesn't take much most of the time when I'm talking to the church, you've lived through even more of this shift than I've experienced. You've sensed it more deeply than I have. You could probably tell me far different and maybe more applicable and better stories than I can tell or will try to tell today. But I think one of the outcomes of this, as we live in the here and now in 2025, is widespread that we have a lot of feelings of loss. Part of the change is that we've lost something, the way things were, something that we would often articulate as better. It was easier to be a Christian. We feel irrelevant, that the world around us that doesn't share our Christian convictions and our sacred values as followers of Jesus, we're easily ignored. Right? We all gather together on Saturday nights and Sunday mornings for worship, and, well, isn't that great? We're all here, but does anybody outside of this building care? And it feels like they don't. And so, compounding these two things, the sense of loss, the sense of irrelevancy, we could add more, and I'll say a little more in a couple of minutes. We end up feeling also a sense of resentment about it all. Why is it so hard? Isn't It's supposed to be different. What happened? It's really difficult to do ministry in our time. It feels that way, especially for those of us who are trained professionally for it, but not just us, the lay people that we lead in congregations like this and elsewhere, because what we're observing is, in general, not everywhere, but in general, there's no urgency for witness, and so there is no growth of congregations, of church bodies. This is a general, sociological, empirically measurable trend. Christianity is, in general, on the decline. There are fewer and fewer of us in our culture. The people that we think we ought to reach and want to reach, we receive from them this general sense of apathy. It goes along with that irrelevancy I mentioned before. It's as if we're trying to do ministry to people who don't seem to need a God. And so try as we might with programs and trying to be hospitable and welcoming and attractive and beautiful architecture, wonderful music, great place for our kids, etc., 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 all the things that you can imagine and that you've experienced the church try, and it bears not the fruit that we're hoping for. It leads many of us, especially those professionally trained, for whom it is our livelihood, to begin to feel a sense of exhaustion, to then move into a kind of depression, and from there, frustration and anger. Perhaps at God, perhaps at the people that we work with, perhaps at the people outside that they just won't respond, and why don't they get it? Statistically, there are a handful of reports out there that say in the last 5 years, since COVID, more professionally trained ministers have considered leaving the ministry because of how difficult it has become. This is just part of it. COVID exacerbated it terribly. It was a really crazy social crisis to live through and especially try to do ministry through in a faithful way. But I think this isn't just for those of us who are trained professionally. It boils over and bleeds over into the lay people who are our partners in ministry and whom we shepherd and work with on a regular basis. Churches like ours generally have a pretty common reaction to all of this. And it's simple. This is bad, and we need to do something. Churches like ours, I think, are helpfully described by, I would say, he's probably the premier sociologist of culture and religion of our time, James Davison Hunter, and his really excellent book, To Change the World. Churches like ours are conservative. We tend to be right-leaning, both politically and socially. And so he says the way we articulate the problem is this. We say secularization is the problem. And secularization is this idea, this theory from the 1960s that sociologists came up with that said as society progresses more and more technologically, we will have less and less need for religion and God, because we will have more and more control over reality as we live and experience it. By the 1990s, just 3 decades later, one of the primary sociologists who put forth this idea, Peter Berger, happened to be a Lutheran of all people, started to repudiate his own theory and say, no, we were wrong. Secularization isn't happening, at least in the way that we imagined that it would. In fact, he said, we're more religious than ever. But that religiosity is not of the traditional sort. What we're not seeing is more and more Christians and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Mormons. What we're seeing is people who are hybridizing their faith and becoming a Christian Buddhist, for example, or exploring more and more pagan ideas and Wiccan ideas and various other things of that sort. But at any rate, for those of us who've been caught up in this idea that secularization is the explanation for the challenges that we're facing, shrinkage and the difficulty of doing ministry, we don't just name a problem, we have a predominant emotional reaction that goes along with it. And that word is resentment. He's borrowing from the French, a word that actually comes from Friedrich Nietzsche. And It does mean resentment. You could kind of see that in there, but it is a bigger bucket term in French. It includes additional things like anger, outrage, envy, jealousy, the sense of loss, and even the sense that something sacred and important to us is being taken away. And you hear it articulated in phrases like this: we're losing the church because of the left or progressives or liberals or frankly, using that diagram that John had up earlier, name your them. There is a lot of thems for all the us's out there in the world. We experience part of what Nisbet mentioned, the decline of Christian values in particular. No place for our voice or influence at the table, partly because we're treated as utterly irrelevant. And again, that sense that something sacred has been, and perhaps is still being, taken away from us by some hidden, invisible them, some kind of shadow agent or agency out there. This tended to be our predominant reaction. Let's say a little bit more about secularization by defining the word secular. I want to borrow, to do this, from perhaps the greatest living philosopher today in the English language. He is a Frenchman, lives in Montreal, Quebec. His name is Charles Taylor. In a book called The Secular Age, published in 2007, so critically acclaimed that it not only won several more than $1 million awards, but scholars even now consider it to be the sort of book that will still be being read in the 22nd century, right? Written fairly early in the 21st. It's 875 pages long. I wouldn't recommend it to any of you. And that isn't because I don't think any of you are incapable. But Taylor writes in such a way that he assumes you have a lot of prior knowledge. So if you're trained in history, politics, the history of politics, philosophy, theology, economics, and sociology, then maybe read the book. It might be deeply fruitful and fulfilling for you. But if you're not that person, there's a really helpful, accessible text that basically takes this argument, makes it concise in about 150 pages, and it's written for people like us, lay people, trained church professionals, to help us understand. It's called How Not to Be Secular. The author is James K.A. Smith. I can repeat all of these if you want, either now or later. But here's the animating question of Taylor's book. He asks this: how did we go from a time, say 1500, Luther's day, when Christianity was the default identity of nearly everyone born in the North Atlantic world? So imagine Western Europe, what would eventually become the colonized places of Canada and the United States. How did we go from that sort of time to a time when Christianity or any religion is treated merely as an option? And to tell that 500-year story takes him about 875 pages. It is not a straight line. It isn't one thing after another. It is this plodding, meandering, wandering story that just weaves in all kinds of ideas, and the outcomes of which didn't have to be this way, but the age that we live in is secular. And so he tries to give, at the very beginning, a definition of what he thinks we mean when we use this word. And we use it fairly commonly. So the first definition that he gives is this sense of faith as being something that is private. And perhaps all of us feel like this is quite normal. It is the sort of thing that is private. If you're a public school teacher, you are expected to go into your classroom and take off the cloak of your faith, hang it on the hook outside the door, and go in and teach in such a way that you are not bringing your religious biases into the classroom and oppressing your students with this sort of thing. If you are a scientific researcher, right? You take off the cloak of your faith and you put on your lab coat before you go into your laboratory so you can do your scientific research in a non-biased way. If you work in law and you are a judge, for example, before entering your chambers, you're taking off the cloak of your faith, and before you put on your normal judging chamber clothes, right, you go in there and you kind of set aside this part of who you are. This is the idea that faith is private. It's a really silly idea. There's not actually a way for any of us to do this. There are methods that are helpful for us thinking a bit more objectively, right? To try to mitigate and moderate against some of our biases so we can get to the truth. But getting to the truth is a very Christian impulse in and of itself. There's no way of fully separating ourselves from this in any of the spaces in which we work or exist. Our faith is part of the fabric of our being. But it's been treated socially as something that is supposed to remain in a place like this, a church, or with you in your cars, you're listening to your devotions, or singing along to worship songs or hymns as you go along, or listening to your Christian podcasts, or reading your Christian books, or when you're home alone and you're studying your scriptures and reading your devotions as a family perhaps, or spending time in prayer with God. There's a corollary to this, and that is that the public sphere is emptied of religion and religious influence. And I think here's something that we can also relate to in terms of our experience. So how many here have heard of blue laws? Show of hands. Usually it's a smattering of people. It's a few more than in some of the other places where I ask this question. Blue laws are actually an inheritance, a Christian inheritance from those, our forebears who left Europe, came to America for the sake of religious freedom. And they were established, they were literally laws established to keep Sunday sacred. And most of the time they had to do with limiting commerce on Sundays. So early part of the 20th century, or early to mid part, there were laws of this sort that said you cannot buy a car on Sunday. But most of us are more familiar with them in terms of the sale of alcohol. Either you can't buy it at all on Sunday, or it's limited to a certain number of hours within the day, and so on and so forth. And they still exist in small pockets across the country, but they're slowly disappearing. This is part of what I mean, the disappearance of this sort of influence. But another one I think is just a little bit more common and a little bit more of the sort that kind of hits home. And that is, when one of your parishioner families comes in and says to you or to your pastor, I'm sorry, Jimmy has got, his traveling baseball league this weekend. Games are all day Saturday and Sunday. It's halfway across Illinois. Sorry, we won't see you in worship this Sunday. Or, sorry, Jenny, she's got gymnastics. There's a meet all day long. It starts at 7:30. Sure, it's at the local high school, but she's in all of these events back to back to back. It goes through the middle of the afternoon. Sorry, we're not going to be able to see you in church on Sunday. And now maybe even as you come here, you drive by huge masses of space, of soccer fields and baseball and softball fields that are filled with people who could be here with you as you're on your way here. And that's just one of the ways that I mean the public sphere is emptied of religion and religious influence. Sunday is no longer sacred. And Taylor would say this is one way that we talk about living in a secular age. It's one meaning of secular. So let's call it secular one. The second definition is this idea that religion and religious participation are in decline. I've already mentioned this. It maybe sounds a little bit more familiar, maybe even a little bit more current, and it has its own corollary, that people are disaffiliating from religion. All I mean by this is to kind of reference the so-called nuns, if you've heard of them, the N-O-N-E-S's. They are the sorts of people who, say in the last 20 years, as social surveys have changed and new options have become available, what kind of religion are you? Catholic, Buddhist, Protestant, Jew, whatever. All of those are older options, but this newer one is none, nothing whatsoever, something of that sort. There's been a significant increase in the number of people who are choosing that box. And Taylor would call this the second definition of what we mean by secular. And it's measurable empirically. So even if you haven't experienced it, noticed it, or heard of it, there are people talking about it. In 2021, the Gallup poll, for the first time since 1937, in all the years it's been asking about church membership amongst adults in America, for the first time in 2021, that number dropped below 50%. And it was big news that year. Similarly, the Pew Research Group asks lots of questions about religion on the regular. So on the left side in the red, you see the decline of those who identify as Christian adults in America, whereas in the gray on the right-hand side, you see the increase of the so-called nones, or the unaffiliated, or sometimes sociologists call them the spiritual but not religious, the SBNRs. This is a little bit older of data, and I wish I had some new stuff to drop in here. And every time I look at Pew, they don't have just the kind of right equivalent of these graphs. So I keep using them, but I will say, on the left-hand side, that gray line is probably up to about 33%, a third of the American population right now today, according to other data sources that I've seen and spent time looking at over the last couple of years. It's plateaued, however. There isn't any longer, or at least recently, an increase. Nobody quite knows what that means yet. You got to have a lot of time to really assess the meaning of this data. But what we can say is that the majority of people who are in that bucket, who claim to be none or unaffiliated or nothing whatsoever, tend to be the youngest generations from whom we can get reporting data of this sort. So we don't know sort of my kids yet. I have a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old. They are technically Gen Alpha. It's not legal for us to survey them. My 13-year-old, just 2 weeks ago turned 13. So I suppose with parental consent, she could fill out a survey and that data could be used. But usually it has to be someone 18 or older. So what we know is the millennials and the so-called members of Gen Z tend to fill the largest numbers of those who are unaffiliated. Now, on an annual basis, it doesn't matter if it's Pew or Gallup, Public Religion Research Institute, Lifeway, Barna, what have you. This data comes out on an annual basis. We've been talking about it in the church for several years. For those of us who are trained professionally, we're maybe a bit more aware of it than everyone else. And as this data comes out, there's all kinds of commentary and punditry about it. The blogs take off, the podcasts take off, even the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and various other publications talk about it, CNN, NPR, and so on. And one of the effects of all of that is they get all of us who are trained professionally to do this for our livelihood and our lifetime, they get us all spun up. We're just wringing our hands about the fact that traditional religion as we know it is in the decline, and people who are going in some other direction is on the increase. And essentially what's happening is they begin to name our fears in all of their writing and their reflection and their punditry. Where are they? Why did they go? What can we do? And the effect of that, in aggregate, I think, is the sense that many of us who do this and think about this for a living come to believe that the problem to address for our career, our ministry career, is church decline and disaffiliation. How do we stave off the bleeding? How do we stop the loss? And that's motivated in two different ways. One, we've got the spiritual urgency that every Christian should have, that all of you presumably have, because, well, you came here tonight. We've got the spiritual urgency to share the gospel with people. Because this Jesus that we know, who has done so much for us, saved us and given us a future and a hope, is that same Jesus for them. He wants to be for them. That news is also for them. And so that spiritual urgency is in us, a Holy Spirit-driven motivation to give it away. But there's also the practical urgency. For those of us who are actually supporting a family off of this work, it means our income is potentially called into question. It means The stability of buildings like this and every other Christian church and ministry is called into question. It means that programs like our VBS that require volunteers and creative people and servants willing to give up their time and even take time off of work and set aside some of their livelihood to come and serve the spiritual urgency. With decline, we have fewer and fewer of all of these things. They all become a little bit more at risk. And so it isn't just a spiritual kind of anxiety. It's a bit of a practical one, too, for some of us. Despite how strong all of that feels, Taylor wants to say, none of this is the most important thing we should be thinking about when we think about what it means to live in a secular age. And you might be like, what? Like, how could it not be? Well, let's try to get there. And I'll do it via an analogy. It's simple. It's the difference between weather and climate, right? The weather is just phenomenal right now. Next weekend, it's going to be in the 90s again. Dang it all. You know, like, when will it end? When will fall come? We're all longing for it at this time of year. The weather is just what's happening out there today, and we respond as necessary. If it was cold, we'd come in bundled up. If it was snowing, we would have plowed the parking lot and salted it, and we'd all be dragging chips of salt into the... If it was raining, we'd all have an umbrella that we're carrying in here with us, and so on and so forth. The weather is just what's happening now, right? Observable, empirically measurable, fairly easily to predict, at least a few days ahead of time. The climate is something different. The climate is the conditions, the set of conditions that make the weather as we experience it possible. The climate is the set of conditions that make the weather as we experience it possible. So to run with that analogy, let's look back at what we talked about. Decline, privatization, the fact that Sunday is no longer sacred. People are believing in new and different ways and walking away from traditional religion. Taylor would argue this is merely a weather report from Secular 1 and Secular 2. It's not getting at the real problem. It isn't naming the conditions that have made this weather possible. It's not naming the conditions that's made this weather possible. So, he offers what I think to be a remarkably helpful third definition. He says, what it means to live in a secular age is to live in an age of implausibility, where it's difficult to believe. In other words, belief of any sort, not just our kind of belief, not just Christian belief, but belief of any sort is contestable and therefore contested. And we experience this. If you know the comedian Bill Maher, used to have a special on HBO, his favorite target is religious people. And his favorite target amongst religious people is usually Christians. For a while, it was Muslims after 9/11. But for the most part, it's people like us. So we experience our faith as contested, right? In the grand scale of the public sphere and even on one-to-one levels of relationship. And Taylor would say this is the third definition of secular, the one that he wants to emphasize and have us consider the most important. It's the climate for him. The conditions, really, that account for Secular 1 and Secular 2. He says this experience of contestable belief and their contestation leads to a situation which he calls fragilization. It's nothing other than the feeling of being haunted by other possibilities of belief, that is, either believing something different than you believe now, or embracing something like skepticism or unbelief, wondering if any of this can really be true and how can I ever know anyway? And he says this fragilization happens through human relationships, through the experience of what he calls cross-pressure. So let me help you try to imagine this before I quote Taylor for a minute. I used to live in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the things that the Pacific Northwest was known as was the Silicon Forest. So we are all aware of Silicon Valley, San Francisco, the Bay Area, and south of there, probably north of Monterey, between there and San Francisco. Intel had a huge factory out to the west of Portland, Oregon, where I used to live. And tons of other industries similar to Microsoft and Intel and Google and so on were doing work there. Imagine you're some kind of software engineer, and your team at Intel is being rejiggered. And in comes this guy from India. And he's a software engineer just like you on your team, and you guys hit it off, no problem. You find out that you both love the same things about software engineering, you love the same things about the work that your team is doing, and you quickly become close friends and in partnering on all the work that your team is doing. You find out even more that it isn't just the work that you do that you share in common, but oh my goodness, he's a fan of the Seattle Seahawks just like you are, because that's what people are fans of out there. I am a Detroit Lions fan, and I will continue to be. But common out there in Portland, right, south of Seattle as we were. But even more, you find out you like the same sorts of food, right? Let's take tacos, I don't know. But out in the Pacific Northwest, another thing that's really popular is beer and beer brewing. There's so many microbreweries and craft breweries out there. You could try 2 new beers per day, every day of the year, and still not get through all the new beers that they were creating on a regular basis in the Portland area. It's probably provable. I've never done it, but my goodness, there's something new on the menu all the time. You find out that you love the same shows. You listen to the same podcast. You like the same music, and so on and so forth. You feeling me? He had been looking for a house since he moved in. Come to find out, he moves into your same neighborhood. In fact, the street over, his back fence kitty corners up to your back fence. Even more, his daughter is in your daughter's class over at the middle school, and they've become fast friends. And more your family spends time together, and you find out that you share almost everything in common except your most sacred convictions. On the weekends, you go to church, and he goes to temple. That's it. Taylor talks about it like this. He says, in our pluralistic age, where we're surrounded by a multiplicity of faiths, he says, it has little effect as long as it's neutralized by the sense that being like them is not really an option for me. As long as the alternative is strange and other, perhaps despised, but perhaps just too different, too weird, too incomprehensible, so that becoming that isn't really conceivable for me, well, so long will their difference not undermine my embedding in my own faith. This is probably quite descriptive of most of you in the room. Not all of you, most of you. You probably find it highly unlikely that even in a relationship with someone like I just kind of set up, that you would ever be tempted to ask the question, why my way and not his or hers? Most of us have been deeply embedded in our faith and convictions for a very long time. And the cliche is true. Sometimes cliches are cliches because they're true. The cliche is true is, it's hard to teach old dogs new tricks, and I'm not calling any of you old. But Taylor goes on to say this. He says, this situation changes when, through increased contact, interchange, perhaps even intermarriage, the other person becomes more and more like me in everything else but faith. Same activities, professions, opinions, tastes, and so on. Then the issue posed by the difference becomes more insistent. Why my way and not his or hers? There's no other difference left to make the shift preposterous or unimaginable. And I want to emphasize that this isn't an intellectual sort of thing. It isn't about what's happening in our craniums. It's an affective sort of thing. It's about our relationship and how we've come to love someone else so deeply that we begin to wonder. It's motivated out of that affective part of us. Why my way and not his or hers? It isn't a question that can be answered by something like Christian apologetics or worldview studies that's going to answer objections about differences from Christianity. That doesn't address here. It's just more information to stuff into here. We're not computers. We're not brains on a stick. as if our heads, you crack it open, you put in the right sorts of input and the right sorts of output happen. Human beings don't work that way. We're embodied beings, and it's very different. Paying attention to the affective is critical in our time. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. And if you don't feel like this sort of situation affects you, you better believe that it affects your kids and your grandkids. You better believe it. You also better believe that it accounts for why we're treated as irrelevant, why it feels like we're doing ministry to people who don't seem to need a God. Because, well, most of the people outside our doors who aren't ever interested in gracing the threshold, much less coming further inside to see what's going on, they're all set. They're all set. What I mean is, despite the fact that they too live in an age of implausibility, no one like you has come along yet to make them wonder, why my way and not his or hers? And so that's what I want to try to move us toward. I want to try to move us toward those moments in human relationship where the light can break through. Not with strategies that have been used in the past. Maybe you've heard of evangelism explosion. Maybe you've even been trained in it. We don't live in a time anymore where cold calling at someone's door is really going to work all that effectively for evangelism. People still try it. People still try it. You can do it if you want. But when you ask that question, if you were to die tonight, what would happen to you? Where would you be? I don't think it's going to cause the existential crisis that it once caused. That longing, that sense of looking for something more doesn't manifest that way. So I think we've got to look for other ways, other God-given, built into the order of things, human relationship sort of ways, that God might actually be working. And so I want to use this analogy. The light breaks through what I'll call cracks in the secular, and I'll describe them through talking about 3 different kinds of human experience. So here's where it gets practical, but it's against that background of faith being, living in an age of implausibility, belief being difficult, faith being difficult. And so the first one that I want to talk about is what I'll call hauntings. I don't have a better word for it. Second one, reaching upward. I'll define that as we go along, and breaking in the third one, and I'll describe that as we go along. So hauntings, I just want to go back to this idea of fragilization for just a second. It isn't just the sort of thing that happens to believers. Remember, we said this was relational. It happens because of that cross pressure of knowing someone who has very, very different convictions in a deep sort of way, where you start to ask that question, why my way and not his or hers? It's not just believers who doubt. Even skeptics can, if faced with the right sort of situation. And one of those situations is the kinds of questions that tend to haunt human experience from time to time, the really big questions. Where did I come from and why am I here? What happens when I die? What is the purpose of all of my life? What is the bigger picture that I fit into? And of course, the really intractable and difficult one that tries to account for evil and so on. And I want to just focus on one of them, the so-called wake-up call to mortality, the realization that at some point, all of us are going to die. In his one of his memoirs, the English writer Julian Barnes, entitled Nothing to be Afraid of, says that the wake-up call to mortality sounds like a hotel service, he says. And then he goes on to say, it is like being in an unfamiliar hotel room where the alarm clock has been left on the previous occupant's setting, and at some ungodly hour you're suddenly pitched from sleep into darkness, panic, and a vicious awareness that this is a rented world. Or, in other words, that your time is limited, and in fact, shorter than you would hope that it would be. Of course, this happens when you're diagnosed with something terminal. At any point in life when that might happen, but many of us have also gone through a transition as we move from being younger people to more mature people. And I don't exactly know when it happens for everyone, but I remember when it happened for me. I was 19. It was early in 2002. I was on a plane flying from Philadelphia to Madrid to visit my fiance. who was studying there to become fluent in Spanish. And I went through probably the worst turbulence that I still have ever experienced in my whole life. And of course, it wasn't very long after they served the meal. So, we're holding on to I was white knuckling in on the chair rails, for dear life, and also trying to not have my food or my neighbors spill on me or them. Burned in the back of my memory was what had happened 5 months previous, when we saw 2 planes crash into the tallest buildings in the world, and the destruction around the Pentagon and the field in Pennsylvania. That was my moment where I thought, maybe I'm going to die in a real serious rather than kind of theoretical sort of way. That's what Barnes is trying to talk about. In his biography of Steve Jobs, Walter Isaacson talks about one of the last moments in Jobs' life as he was really suffering through cancer. He was getting toward the end. Isaacson says, "One sunny afternoon, when he wasn't feeling well, Jobs sat in the garden behind his house and reflected on death. I'm about 50-50 on believing in God," he said. "For most of my life, I felt that there must be more to our existence than meets the eye." He admitted that as he faced death, he might be overestimating the odds out of a desire to believe in an afterlife. "I'd like to think that something survives after you die," he said. "It's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures." He fell silent for a very long time. "But on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch," he said. "Click, and you're gone." And he paused again and smiled slightly. Maybe that's why I never like to put on-off switches on Apple devices. If we join up Julian Barnes' comments and Jobs' reflection here at the end of his life, that thought that we're all going to die can act as a kind of wake-up call for just about anybody. It's one of those cracks through which the light can shine. You gotta be there when it happens. It only works in close human relationships built on trust. But this kind of common experience is the sort of thing that indicates, I think, just how persistently we're haunted by the possibility that there might be something more, something unseen, something enchanted, something beyond. In another place, Barnes, who's an agnostic, nevertheless says, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him." I don't believe in God, but I miss him. What could that possibly mean? I wonder if it's helpful to think, as an answer to that question, about the fact that, why is it in the last 20, 25 years, our culture has become obsessed and gobs of money have been made over fantasy stories. Worlds built on a sense of enchantment and power and forces of good and evil, from Star Wars in the late 1970s, but even more strongly in the last 25 years, Harry Potter, the Twilight series, dystopian stories, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, which they're remaking a series of again on Netflix, and it probably will do successfully if it isn't poorly produced. Why do we love Marvel Comics and DC Comics and all of these superheroes so much? Why? Well, I wonder if it's a similar answer to what Barnes said. We were made for a world like that, an enchanted world. But that's not the kind of world we experience. And so, we love those stories because we miss that kind of a world. I don't know if I'm right about this. It's a hunch. But all of these stories offer us a vision of something that's beyond, that's more, that's unseen, that's enchanted. There's something attractive about that. I don't know what this church might do with it, or your church if this isn't yours. Some of these movies have bad language, sex scenes. They're full of violence. Could you show them here? There might be some strong objection. Could you watch them in your home and lead a discussion about it and ask, what's going on here that maybe points us to something more? And then open a space to be able to tell the story of something more that you know and live by. Do you feel me? The wake-up call to mortality, the sense that we miss these sorts of enchanted worlds. We live with a very scientific imagination. Right? Let's talk about the rainbow for just a minute. And I don't mean the flag. Right? I don't want to get into that kind of conversation. But the rainbow, the thing that happens in the sky. And the sun is shining and it's raining at the same time. And we sometimes are blessed with being able to see it. The biblical story about that is what? It comes with a promise. See, I've put my bow in the sky. It's promised to Noah and his kin. I will never annihilate humanity again. How many of us look at the rainbow and think about the biblical promise? I'm thinking few of us. If we look at it all, we're like, oh, that's pretty. But if we go just a little further, maybe it's more like, I know what that is. That is the refraction of light rays through suspended water droplets in the sky. Sometimes the scientific imagination that we live with, despite all of its benefits, is a pretty significant buzzkill. Right? That's part of what I mean when I say I think we miss a world of enchantment. One of the things that's true about a secular age is we not only doubt our beliefs in an age of implausibility, we also doubt our doubts. So even for the skeptic, that you never thought you might reach, right? When they're haunted by the wake-up call to mortality, or you find out that they love Star Trek for the same reasons that you love Star Trek. The enchanted world, the power, the more, the beyond, and so on. The possible impossibilities that are on display there. I wonder if it's a connection to the fact that we were made for a world like that. But those are a couple of cracks in the secular through which the light shines. A second example is this idea of reaching upward. And by that I mean we're reaching upward to the transcendent. Again, I'm being generic and vague. I'm trying to think from the outsider's point of view, because I used to be one. Right? What would someone who's not a Christian talk about? You know, God in a generic sense, the divine, the transcendent, and so on. And I want to talk about this through two little examples, the idea of replacement religion and the compulsion to confess. But first I want to ask, what are we reaching up for? What are we reaching up for? And I think the best possible answer is this: to be known and loved by God. And by the end of talking through this, I'm going to arrive at this really fancy word that we Lutherans love, justification. Because that's what it is to be known and loved by God. It's to be justified. But I want to start on the front end by thinking about it a different way. From the really well-known German Luther scholar, Oswald Bayer, he says, those who justify themselves are under compulsion to do so. There's no escape. We cannot reject the question that others put to us. Why have you done this? What were you thinking about? I apologize for the typo. Might you not have done something else? Complaints are made against us. We're forced to justify ourselves, and as we do so, we usually want to be right. In his really helpful book, I've recommended it to so many pastors, it's super preachable, every chapter. The writer David Zoll says, all of us struggle with this idea that we never quite feel like we're enough. And he says the effort to be enough is often competitive or performative. So he articulates it this way. We're trying to be wealthy enough, successful enough, thin enough, beautiful enough, at times woke enough. And he just goes on with all of these things, and he says, what we seem to imagine in the back of our minds is this sense that if I had enough, if I got enough, the vindication and justification that I hope for would be mine. That if there was enough of what it is I'm seeking, then I would finally be enough. And so it ends up being competitive or performative in a handful of different ways. Through how we raise our families. Right? I don't know if any of you brag about your kids and live vicariously through their success as if it's your success, right? They've achieved something and you can somehow take credit for it, and you can't help but being proud of them, of course. There's nothing wrong with that. But then, maybe the way you share it and the way you talk about it with your peers comes off just a little smug, just a little, wink and a smile, like, yeah, I'm doing a little better than you are. My family's a little better off than you are. There used to be a trend on social media of mommy blogs, and all kinds of women, of young children, were looking at these sorts of things and following these mommies, and often what would come up is pictures of an entirely messy and chaotic home with the line, my house might look terrible to you, but my kids are making memories, right? This kind of smug self-justification, pat on the back, in a way that very easily made many other moms of young children feel less than. It happens in our careers as all of us are working our way up the ladder, whether it's titles or people that we're associated with or the amount of money that we make and so on and so forth. It's competitive and we show it off and we talk about it. It happens in terms of the things that we advocate for, what we hashtag and retweet and share on social media, all of which often are subtle signals in terms of what we are for, what side we are on, supporting the right cause, being on the right side of history, etc., etc. And Zoll just simply keeps suggesting whatever we use to become enough effectively acts as replacement religion. What we're trying to do is justify ourself. Enoughness becomes a kind of self-righteousness, and replacement religion becomes nothing more than an alternative approach to self-justification. Put this together with another social trend, this need to confess. Elizabeth Bruenig, a handful of years ago, in a really wonderful journal called the Hedgehog Review, says this. She says, confession, once rooted in religious practice, has assumed a secular importance that can be difficult to describe. Certainly, confessional literature is everywhere. In drive-by tweets, hashtagged confess an unpopular opinion, therapeutic reality television settings, tell-all celebrity memoirs, and blogs brimming with lurid details set to endless scroll. Public confession has become both self-forming and culture-forming. Although in some sense we know less about each other than ever, almost every piece of information we do learn is an act of intentional or performative disclosure. So this idea that we're putting out bids for a certain kind of attention, and most of the time we're doing this on social media. We most certainly do it as well in places like church. It's about how you dress when you show up on Sunday, and what kind of car you drive and how clean it is, and so on and so forth, and what people you chum with. But on social media, we do it in much more subtle ways. But what's happening in the background is, if we think of confession as this kind of vulnerable intimacy, right, where I'm sharing a part of myself, taking a risk, these questions sort of lurk behind it. If you know this about me, will you still love me? If this is true about me, am I still acceptable? Am I alone here? Am I the only one, and must I remain alone now? If we think about confession this way, along with the idea of replacement religion, compulsion to confess in our secular age, I think, is another crack. It opens a space for encountering God and the forgiveness of Jesus offered by the church. Scripture exhorts us to confess our sins. Fairly recent contemporary Christian song, Matthew West's Let the Truth Be Told, does the same. The classic text by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he says, when the confession of sin is made in the presence of another Christian, the last stronghold of self-justification is abandoned. And Luther even exhorted us to confession in a special section of his large catechism. He says, when I admonish you to confession, I'm admonishing you to be a Christian. Confession needs forgiveness. And when we encounter this crack in the lives of people, and I think we encounter it in everybody that we see in this room, we all do this, right? Replacement religion and this trying to be enough. My goodness, it's exhausting, isn't it? It's utterly exhausting. But we come to church and we hear real justification. We're people who have received the good news of the gospel, that even as enemies of God, Christ died for us. That's a transformative experience. It makes us, in the reception of it, the kinds of people who can also offer it. In the same place that Luther made those comments that I quoted earlier, he says, God has put absolution, the words of forgiveness, in the mouths of his people. Not just the pastor, but his people. That means that we have something to give away. And very likely, strangers aren't going to cross the threshold of a building like this and come talk to the pastor. They're nice guys. I know them. I appreciate them. They're well appreciated by their people. But that's an unsafe thing to do. No, I'd much rather talk to somebody I know. This Christian person over here. What would they say as I struggle through this and wrestle through this out loud with them? That's one of those moments. But again, when is it going to happen? I don't know. Is it ever going to happen? Maybe not. But God has made us ready. When it does, we can offer the gift that God has given us. What are we reaching up for? Again, I think it's justification. In other words, God's love. To know that we're accepted by the divine. All this competition, this performative replacement religion stuff, this confession out loud, it's all bids to be accepted and affirmed. To the extent that I think we treat our horizontal relationships with other people, whether in person, embodied relationships, or on social media, as we kind of project idealized versions of ourselves that we think people will like, that if we get enough likes and affirmation and attention and acceptance there, we treat it maybe like it's a proxy for a vertical relationship with my Creator. Well, see, God, they all love me. How can you not? But that's not the way the story works. We're able to tell the story the way that it works. So the third one, breaking in, just a little longer. Hang with me. I maybe should have skipped one of these examples and just did two, but I have so much I want to give away. So this idea of breaking in, another way of talking about it is holy moments, and they come in two different forms, negative experiences and positive. So one sense, we've got the crisis of personal suffering, the experience of tragedy and grief, and again, that unexpected confrontation with mortality. Paul Kalanithi experienced that last one, and tragedy and grief and personal suffering all in one. This little, maybe take you 2 hours to read, this short little autobiography, memoir sort of book. Paul Kalanithi was the chief resident in neuroscience and neurology at Stanford University Hospital. And it was expected that when he finished his residency there, he would become head of neurology and neurosurgery at Stanford University Hospital. He was given all of the most difficult brain surgery cases because somehow God created him to be able to handle the most delicate sorts of surgical work. One of the things that he starts out the book saying is most people don't know where brain cancer comes from. It doesn't usually begin in the brain. It tends to begin in the lungs and metastasizes to the brain from there. And that's a little bit of foreshadowing, because come to find out, not long after, he begins to experience the symptoms of that kind of lung cancer. Come to find out he has it. And he moves out of practice for a while and becomes a patient. He chooses one of his fellow doctors to take care of him, and she immediately demands that the dynamic of how they relate changes. While he used to be chief resident, and in a way her boss, she is now the physician and he is the patient. And as she began to treat him, he experienced an entirely different way of doctoring than what he was used to doing with his patients. He admitted out loud, "I used to treat my patients like paperwork." Mere paperwork. Not people, paperwork. But she treated me like a whole person. And not just me, my wife as my primary caregiver. They were still fairly young and fairly early in their marriage at the time. Great part of the story is the treatment tends to have a really positive effect, to the extent that he's actually able to get back to work. And so, having learned from the experience of how she doctored with him, he began to doctor differently. He began to treat people holistically, and not just them, their caregivers, their family members, and it paid a kind of dividend. He said, if I hadn't become a physician, I might have become a pastor. Kalanithi was a Christian, and this experience did revive some of his spirituality, even as a highly trained scientist. That experience, that deeply fulfilling experience of caring for people holistically, I think we can relate to that when we think about just doing acts of service as Christians. I think one of the things that God has built into the order of things is that when we serve others, it feels good. It feels good. That isn't why we serve others. That isn't the primary motivator. It's a secondary effect. We serve others because God has called us to do so, and he's put needy neighbors in our lives who he's given us the capacity to care for in some way. But when we do it, that was pretty nice. I might think about doing that again. I think Kalanithi was experiencing that same sort of thing. Sadly, his lung cancer metastasized to his brain, and he eventually passed away, never becoming the person that everybody hoped and believed he would become. The end of the book, in fact, the last chapter, is written by his wife, so I highly recommend reading this. Borrow it from your library, get it on your Kindle, 2 hours, make sure you have a Kleenex. But in Kalanithi's life, the holy moments really is all of these experiences together was the kind of experience where his faith was revived. C.S. Lewis famously said, God shouts in our pains. They are wake-up calls. Well, Kalanithi was a Christian. He kind of knew how to respond well. It revived his faith. For the people that we come across in our lives who are going through moments of pretty challenging suffering and turmoil, they don't have that same kind of conviction, that same kind of hope that we have, but they have us as friends. Well, we might be able to speak that good news into their life in that moment. Again, these are unpredictable. We don't know when they're going to happen. The positive side, moments of inarticulable joy, such as the miracle of childbirth, the miracle of being healed, the miracle of, frankly, being saved from a situation where you thought you were going to die. My mother-in-law, who is a DCE, tells stories of a moment when she and a fellow pastor's wife were traveling down the highway after a conference on their way back home, and all of a sudden a hubcap comes off of a car in front of them, and whereas they thought it was coming straight at their windshield and should have gone right through and killed them instantly in that moment, it went right up and over. And to this day, she can't help but believe an angel was there and deflected the trajectory of that hubcap. Is it true? I don't know. In our very scientific age, what could we say? The aerodynamics of the way the air is flown over the car? I don't give a rip, right? When someone thinks they were saved from a situation where they should have died, let's join with them in believing that they were. And let's tell them why. God had more for you to do. God had more for you to do. Let's give him thanks that you're still here. I'm thankful that you're still here. I think it was God that saved you. When my wife and I conceived of our first child, it was around Thanksgiving of 2011. And my wife was serving as a teacher at that time. I was in my graduate studies at the seminary at that time. We would go home to Michigan, where we're from, every year for the holidays. I married my pastor's kid. Families grew up 20 minutes apart. We always went to the same place. And one of the things that would always happen, if you've been a teacher, you've experienced this, you come to the end of the first semester, it's just a long slog, no breaks in the middle, Thanksgiving is not nearly enough, and your body just takes a, and then you get sick. You catch a cold, you get the flu, right? It's part of that time of year as well, right? You pick it up from the little kids that are around you, the nephews and the nieces and the grandkids and so on. And so we go home, and my wife, who, you know, we were pretty confident we're not going to be telling anybody about our pregnancy on this trip. Nevertheless, she started to feel the symptoms of the first trimester, the typical sorts of ones. And we did the best we could to play it off as if what we were actually experiencing was, you know, the sickness that we would always, you know, come home and either bring with us or end up having once we got there, because we finally took a breath. One of the things that we'd always do in her household, a couple days after Christmas, we'd all get in the car and drive about an hour south and go to a big mall in Michigan. Shop the sales, return some things, look around, you know, eat at the food court, just hang out for the day. It was a tradition. You know, malls have fallen out of favor for Amazon and Temu these days, but anyhow, that was one of the things we did. We get back home, my wife heads into the bathroom, clean up and freshen up and all that, and those days we didn't have phones like this. We had little flip phones, and if you wanted to send texts to one another, you know, you had to mash buttons all day. And so we never texted one another. But I carry into the bedroom where we're staying, you know, some of the things that we had, and was putting that away and organizing it, and all of a sudden my phone buzzes, and I open it, and it's a text from my wife. In all capital letters, "Come in here right now." What? The bathroom? Okay, you know, I did, and I walked in there to find her bleeding significantly. And we're blessed to have a brother-in-law who was a physician who lived nearby, so dialed him up. And he was a straight shooter. He's a very gentle straight shooter. But he said, you know, I think you know what this might mean. It could be bad, and the worst sorts of bad. I recommend you get an appointment with your OBGYN as soon as you're back to St. Louis. And so we left vacation early. We're back here just after the new year in the OBGYN's office. Ultrasound's happening, and they're zeroing in very early. It's probably 7 weeks into the pregnancy at this point. And up on the screen pops the image of a fully formed human child in about the most miniature it can be. Zero in even further. This is incredible what technology can do. And all of a sudden, a heartbeat. We weren't expecting to see the image of a child, much less a heartbeat. So we squeezed each other's hands, shed a few tears. It was amazing, but we still didn't know what was wrong. They take picture after picture after picture, the roll of ultrasound pictures, you know, from ceiling to floor. We go in to see the OBGYN who's going to interpret all of this, and he says, you know, here's what's going on. You have a condition called subchorionic hematoma. And what that means is, physiologically for my wife, back behind her uterus where the baby was growing was a huge pool of blood. And it's the sort of condition that can either threaten a pregnancy severely, or the body can actually slowly absorb it and everything will end up being okay. But he said to us before we left, he says, if I was a betting man, I'd bet 75% against this pregnancy going full term. And having read Paul Kalanithi, I now think about that like that was one of those moments where a physician treated me not as a person, but as paperwork. we go down to the parking garage. This is at St. Mary's on Clayton, across from the seminary. We went down there and held hands, and we did the only thing we could do. We prayed. Like there was nothing we could do to make this pregnancy go successfully any further than it was in that moment. It was entirely in God's hands, and we felt that so much more palpably then than any moment before that. And so it was week after week of ultrasounds for a while, and then every month ultrasounds, and everything's going fine. And finally, in August of that year, I held Annabelle in my arms, delivered via C-section, and up to the cheek of her mother, and we wept, and it was a great and glorious moment. And I tell that story to say, look, as a Christian, I got a name for what I experienced. It's called a miracle. It's called fearfully and wonderfully made. It's called knit together in secret in my mother's womb. But how many people out there in our world that we know, that we've got close, trusting relationships with, who don't have that language, who live through these moments of inarticulable joy but don't know how to talk about where it came from, who have the sense that they want to say thank you. And thank you is always something that is intended. It has a direction. It's aimed at someone. Capital O, someone. We can help them do that by saying, here's what I think happened. There's a God that's active in your life that maybe you've never seen, you've never thought of, you've never considered, you've never even wondered about. But he's been paying attention to you. And he's given you this gift. So all of these cracks, all of them, you can't predict them, you can't force them, you don't know when they're going to happen. But God has made us ready. We can be there. We've got something to say. Let me wrap with just this. From the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, the very beginning of this book, The Uncontrollability of the World, he says, "Do you still remember the first snowfall on a late autumn or winter day when you were a child? It was like the intrusion of a new reality. Something shy and strange had come to visit us, falling down upon and transforming the world around us without our having to do anything. An unexpected gift. Falling snow is perhaps the purest manifestation of uncontrollability. We cannot manufacture it, force it, or even confidently predict it, at least not very far in advance. And what's more, we cannot get a hold of it and make it our own. Take some in your hand, it slips through your fingers. Bring it into the house, it melts away. Pack it away into the freezer, it stops being snow and becomes ice. Maybe that's why so many people, not only children, long for it, especially around the holidays. Meteorologists are assailed and beseeched for weeks beforehand. Will it be a white Christmas this year? What are the chances? And of course, there's no shortage of efforts to bring snow under our control. Winter resorts advertise guaranteed snow, making good on their promises with the aid of machines. And these produce artificial snow that holds up even at temperatures above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Our relationship to snow, Rosa says, reflects the drama of our relationship to the modern world as in a crystal ball. And I want to suggest not just our relationship to the modern world, but our relationship to ministry. The driving cultural force of that form of life we call modern is the idea, the hope, and the desire that we can make the world controllable. And I think we feel that way about ministry too. Yet it's only in encountering the uncontrollable that we really experience the world, that we really experience ministry, that we really experience God at work, acting in our lives. So I want to encourage you. Look for opportunities to connect people to the transcendent in spiritual conversations. People who trust you, take the risk as the Spirit leads and talk to them about the God that cares for them, the God for whom they matter infinitely. And use these cracks, right? They're nothing more than conversational and ministry opportunities, and look for more. There are more. My book that I've based this on is out in the lobby. I've got a few more ideas in there. I would love for you to read it, and I really hope that it's helpful. And then finally, remember that all of this is really kind of set against that background of the climate. This age in which it feels like it's difficult to believe. We're not without hope. We're not without opportunities. I actually think it's a pretty exciting time in which to live. Because the opportunity for ministry is just so radically different than it ever has been for a really long time. And so I just encourage you, take heart, take hope. It could be really fun what God might use us to do. Thanks very much.
Well, there is an immense amount of things for us to think about, and I again go back to the story of the Good Samaritan. The crack there is the opening to care, and you've certainly given us much to think about to do so. Thank you very much, Chad. And I know if you may have questions, Chad's going to be available out at the CPH table where his book is for sale, and please avail you of his time this evening. Let's go ahead and close. I'll have you. We're going to close. This series has really grown out of a Bible study of a bunch of grandparents that we've been running for about 5 years called Anna and Simeon, the two old people in the Bible that, and you know that story well. But we always close those sessions with Luther's evening prayer. If you're not Lutheran, this might be new to you, but I think most of you are. So let's go ahead and share that together. I thank you, my heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have graciously kept me this day. And I pray that you would forgive me all of my sins where I have done wrong, and graciously keep me this night. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul, and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the evil foe may have no power over me. Amen. And as we always close here, go in peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. There's wonderful snacks out there. Avail yourselves of that. And next month, we'll welcome Dale Meyer as our speaker, the former the president emeritus of the seminary. So I hope you find a time to join us. Thank you.